The first thing I felt was warmth, not hospital heat, summer heat. The kind that slides under linen curtains and tastes like salt. Waves rolled somewhere past the porch, steady as a heartbeat I wasn't sure was mine. I opened my eyes to pale blue walls and the soft rasp of a ceiling fan. The room smelled like sunscreen, cut lemons, and my childhood. This wasn't a ward. This was the Hampton house. Footsteps downstairs. Sharp, quick. A voice I knew better than my own. "We can't keep waiting, Mom. The longer we sit on this, the messier it gets." Evelyn. My mouth was dry. My arms felt heavy, lead sunk in warm sand. I reached for the glass on the nightstand and found water beaded with condensation, a ring of moisture on the wood. Not a hospital. Home. Another voice, clipped, rehearsed. "It isn't messy if it looks orderly," my mother said. "People forgive anything if it looks clean." A gull cried outside. The fan ticked. Somewhere, ice clinked in a glass. The ocean breeze carried salt and something I couldn't name. A sweetness gone sour. I breathed slowly and stayed still. If they didn't know I was awake, I could hear them tell me who they'd become without me. "What about David?" Evelyn asked. "He needs to present the papers. He said the judge will sign off by Friday if we don't complicate it." Friday. Papers. Judge. What would you have done? Announced you were alive? Or listened to the people who'd already decided how to live without you? I pushed my fingertips into the sheet, grounding myself in the weave. The linen was familiar. A set I bought last summer, coral-stitched edges. Last summer I was alive and planning a new deck design for the back porch. Last summer I had a future. Claire would want stability, my mother went on, calm as the tide. "You're the stable one." "I'm the one here," Evelyn said. "I've been here every day." The walls seemed to shift. Every day. Living in my house. Breathing my air. Touching my father's piano. The one that faced the windows so morning sun stained the keys gold. I eased myself upright, swallowing a groan. Dizziness swept through me, hot and hollow. The glass trembled in my hand. I took one sip. Another. The water tasted like summer hose water, metallic, nostalgic, cruel. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. I froze. Footsteps approached my door and then paused. Whispered voices, too soft to catch. The scent of my mother's perfume slid under the door. Gardenia, expensive and faintly medicinal. The knob twitched. I placed the glass down and closed my eyes. The door opened with the same careful etiquette my mother brought to everything, even trespassing. A tray clinked. The room brightened with her shape in the doorway, cautious and choreographed. "She needs rest," she said, voice drifting toward the bed. "Don't talk to her like she understands." "I'm not stupid," Evelyn whispered back. "Coma patients hear things." I let my lashes part a fraction. The curtain lifted in the sea breeze, and through the sheer I saw them, Evelyn with her hair swept up in a glossier version of me, and my mother with her pearls like armor. Evelyn looked toward the nightstand. Her gaze snagged on the water ring. Her eyes flicked to my hand. I stilled even my breath. "She moved," she said. "Muscle memory," my mother replied too quickly. "Don't invent hope. It has a way of embarrassing people." My chest tightened. Hope embarrasses people. My mother had always preferred tidy grief to messy love. They stepped back into the hallway. Their voices dropped, then rose as they descended the stairs again, as if morality traveled better on the main floor. I slid my legs over the edge of the bed and set my feet on the cool painted wood. The boards were smooth. I'd sanded them myself the summer after Dad died. The air full of dust and lemon oil and tears I'd pretended were sweat. By the time I reached the landing, my head rang but my balance had learned me again. I held the rail and listened. "Declared incapacitated," Evelyn said. "That's what the form says. It's not cruel, it's practical." Practical. The word scraped my skin like old sand. Practical was how people frame theft when they needed to feel holy. "David will handle it," my mother replied. "He knows how to present these things. The town trusts him." A breeze moved through the house, lifting the sheer drapes in the living room like breath. Salt and sunlight. I edged down 2 more steps until I could see the reflection in the foyer mirror. The 2 of them by the hall table, papers spread like a map of my life. My name was everywhere. Claire Bennett. Claire Elise Bennett. My handwriting on a sticky note I didn't remember writing. Keys behind the blue vase. The blue vase stood empty on the console, heavy with absence. Are you sure about the piano? Evelyn asked, thumbing through a list. It's worth something. It's worth more with a story, my mother said. We'll sell it to a family with a daughter who still plays. I remembered Dad's hands square sure, placing mine on middle C. I remembered telling him the house felt like music when the windows were open. He'd smiled and said, then keep the windows open, kid. Another sound joined the house. Tires on gravel, a car rolling to a careful stop. Doors closed gently. Voices muted. Male. Familiar. Evelyn's chin lifted. He's here. Good, my mother said. Let's be efficient. I shrank back into the shadow of the stairwell, palm flat against the cool banister. Through the screen door, a figure crossed the porch, dark suit, summer tie, a face I associated with signatures and comfort. David. He stepped into the foyer, and the house swallowed him the way waves swallow a stone. Quick, clean, inevitable. Thank you for coming, my mother said, already executing hospitality. I made iced tea. He set his briefcase on the table and shook his head. Later. His eyes scanned the room, searching for something that wasn't furniture. How is she? Evelyn laughed, a quick high break in the hush. Sleeping as usual. We were just going over the guardianship filing and the property transfer. If we get the judge to sign by Friday, the deed moves in taxes. David didn't look at her. He looked at the staircase. Slowly. Exactly where I pressed myself against the banister. Heartbeat loud enough to drown the surf. He had always been too observant. It was once a comfort. Now it pinned me to the step. He turned back to them. I'll need to see her. My mother stiffened almost imperceptibly. For what purpose? For mine, he said. A beat passed. The fan ticked overhead. Somewhere on the porch, wind chimes answered the breeze. The house listened with me. My mother smoothed a paper. We trust you, David. That should be sufficient. It isn't, he replied, voice calm in a way that meant it wouldn't bend. If we use the incapacitation clause you're proposing, I'm obligated to confirm her condition today. Evelyn's smile thinned. You confirmed it months ago. I confirmed a prognosis, he said. Not the present. My blood moved faster, a warm tide. He was opening a door I didn't know I still wanted. Evelyn leaned forward, lowering her voice as if ethics required discretion. We've kept this house running. We've paid for everything. She would want us to have it. Would she? He asked. The screen door clicked as the wind shifted. The sea smelled like memory. The room glowed gold as a cloud moved past the sun, light pooling on the hardwood like honey. I remember designing that light, the angle of the windows, the white of the paint, the way morning warmed the floorboards into welcome. I stepped down one more stair. The wood side. David's head lifted by a fraction, just enough like a man hearing a key turn. What's the other envelope? My mother asked, tapping a sealed document in his case. The one you haven't mentioned. He placed a hand on the leather. Something your husband left in my care the week before he died. Silence broke over us like a wave. I gripped the banister. My father. A week before he died he gave David something, and my mother didn't know. What is it? Evelyn asked, greedy soft. Addendum? Asset list. David met her gaze, then my mother's. A letter. My mother's face didn't change. Her posture did, chin higher, shoulders tightening under silk. To whom? To Claire, he said. Heat flashed through me, swift and blinding. The waves outside seemed too quiet to hear it. He left a letter to a daughter who is, my mother began, precise as a blade. Alive, David said, eyes moving again to the stairs. My breath caught. The house held its own. Evelyn's fingers fluttered over the deed like moths. She forced a laugh. That's sentimental. It doesn't affect. It affects everything, David said softly, because it includes a recorded intent for the disposition of this property if she survives. The fan ticked. A bee worried the screen, a tiny thread of sound. My knees weakened and steadied. Survive. I had survived. The word wrapped itself around my spine like a brace. Evelyn's voice dropped to a hiss. You told me. I told you to wait, David said. The next step beneath me creaked. 3 heads turned toward the staircase. Evelyn's lips parted. shock cracking into fear. My mother's eyes widened a fraction, then narrowed into something like management. David's mouth didn't move, but his eyes did. A flicker that felt like a welcome home I could trust. I moved out of the shadow and into the golden light. The house breathed with me. "Hello," I said, my voice rough with disuse and summer. No one spoke. Even the waves held their breath. My mother recovered first. "Claire," she said, tasting my name like a risk. "You should be in bed." "I've been in bed," I answered. "You've been busy." Evelyn clutched the papers, knuckles white. "You heard." "Enough," I said. The word landed like a stone in water, small then widening. David lifted the briefcase and set it on the console, careful, reverent. "There's a letter for you," he said. "From your father." My throat burned. "When?" "The week before he died," he replied. "He also executed a sealed clause I'm authorized to open only in your presence." My mother's smile was gentle and terrible. "Claire, darling, you're not well. This is a lot of information." The heat outside swelled as a cloud slid off the sun, flooding the foyer with bright, unkind light. The ocean air rushed through the screens, clean and relentless. I stepped off the last stair and reached for the envelope David held out, my father's name in the corner in the handwriting that raised me. "Before you open that," Evelyn said, voice trembling, "you should know we filed the incapacitation paperwork yesterday. The judge signs on Friday." Friday. The word echoed against the glass, against the sea, against my ribs. I slid my thumb under the seal. The seal broke cleanly. My father's handwriting flowed across the page, strong, deliberate. The ink slightly faded but stubborn like him. "If you're reading this, Claire, it means the odds bent in our favor. You always believed in building things to last. So did I. That's why I tied the heart of this house to the one person who understands it. You. If something happens to me, this property passes to my eldest daughter, provided she's alive to claim it in person. If you're gone, it's hers forever. If you come back, it's yours again. That's justice the way I see it. Dad." My throat tightened. Justice. The word he'd used like a prayer. The word my mother had twisted into symmetry for her convenience. When I looked up, Evelyn had gone pale. My mother's mouth moved once before sound caught up to it. "David," she said evenly. It's sentimental. Not legally binding." David didn't flinch. "It's a handwritten addendum, witnessed and filed with me. And it's enforceable, Martha." The room cooled. The breeze stilled for a moment, as if the ocean itself was listening. Evelyn's voice cracked. "You can't be serious. She's barely standing." "I'm fine," I said. The steadiness in my voice surprised even me. I wasn't fine. My body trembled, but my will had remembered itself. I folded the letter and placed it back on the table. "He knew you'd try this." My mother's eyes flicked to David. "How long have you known she'd wake?" He didn't answer her. "Long enough to keep the house ready." That's when I noticed the fresh flowers near the piano, the sheets laundered with my detergent, the glass of water replaced every morning. Someone had been caring for me, but not for their reasons. "Was it you?" I asked him quietly. David met my eyes. "Your father asked me to." Evelyn laughed, sharp, disbelieving. "So you're what, her guardian angel?" "Her lawyer/nurse." Her voice was too loud, too brittle. She looked at our mother for support, but Martha had retreated into her chair, her hand trembling around a ring she was twisting. "You both planned this," she murmured. "He knew you knew." "No one planned anything," David said. "But your husband was a wise man. He trusted fairness more than control." I wanted to tell her I wasn't there to punish anyone. But part of me, the part that had heard them dividing my life like silverware, wanted silence to sting them a little longer. I turned toward the piano. The sunlight traced the keys exactly as I remembered. I sat, my legs weak but certain, and let my fingers hover above middle C. When I pressed down, the sound came soft and clean, a low hum of memory that filled the house. The smell of varnish, salt, and paper folded around me. Dad's music. My heartbeat. The sound of the home reclaiming its owner. No one spoke. The air shimmered with something between reverence and dread. Finally, Evelyn whispered, "So what happens now?" I lifted my head. "Now? I think we start telling the truth. The house wasn't just wood and paint. It was layered with years of small betrayals and half-kept promises. After Dad's funeral, I'd stayed in the city, easier to breathe when grief had distance. Evelyn moved into the Hampton house to take care of things. Mom approved. I sent money for upkeep thinking it was temporary, but temporary had turned into occupation. While I recovered in a hospital bed, they'd been holding dinners on the porch, throwing fundraisers under string lights, smiling over champagne in the house my father built for us to heal in. And now, standing among them, I felt the heat of every July that had passed without me. David broke the silence. The court will need an official medical statement from her physician. Once filed, the incapacitation clause is void. Evelyn crossed her arms. And the deed reverts automatically, he said. Her jaw tightened. You'll regret this, David. He gave a small, humorless smile. Regret is a language I stopped speaking a long time ago. Martha rose from her chair, every inch of her posture practiced but fraying. Enough. We'll revisit this when emotions aren't. I turned to her. Weren't you the one who said people forgive anything if it looks clean? That stopped her. Just long enough for a truth to slip in. Dad never forgave you for selling the vineyard, I said. You told him you did it for taxes, but it was because the buyer was your friend's son. Her expression cracked, not fully, just a flicker of guilt behind composure. That has nothing to do with this. It has everything to do with this, I said. Because that was the day you started treating what's ours like what's yours. Evelyn shot me a look I hadn't seen since we were children. Not hatred exactly, but disbelief that I'd said it aloud. You have no idea what it's been like taking care of everything, she said, voice trembling. Mom, the bills, the house. The house you tried to take from me, I said quietly. Her lip quivered. I was protecting it. I stood. From what? From me. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly. A storm building over the water. The first hint of gray threaded through the sunlight spilling across the floor. David gathered the documents. I'll file the retraction papers first thing tomorrow. Until then, no transfers, no sales, no further signatures. Evelyn's eyes darted toward my mother. We can contest this. Right. Martha's answer came slowly, almost in awe. The courts don't favor the dead. David looked at me. You should rest. But rest was the last thing I could do. Every nerve in my body felt awake for the first time in months, maybe years. As he left the house, I followed him to the porch. The air outside was heavy and electric, cicadas shrilling in the trees. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. He paused at the door. Your father asked me to protect what mattered. Sometimes that means waiting for someone to wake up. The ocean wind lifted his tie. His eyes softened. You did. He turned, walking down the steps into the sunlight. I watched him go, the envelope still warm in my hand. Behind me, the house creaked, old wood expanding in the heat, or maybe the sound of old lies settling into dust. That night, I slept on the couch facing the windows. I wanted to see the sunrise hit the piano keys again. I wanted to hear the sea prove I was still alive. But as dawn broke, I woke to find one of the documents from the table slipped under the front door. My name scrawled across it in Evelyn's handwriting. It wasn't a confession. It was a warning. You don't know everything Dad did. The ink was smudged, but the sentence burned clear. The note stayed with me the whole morning. Folded, unfolded, and folded again. You don't know everything Dad did. The words didn't sound like a threat. They sounded like a plea. Rain started early, soft at first, tapping the porch roof like a rehearsal. By noon, thunder rolled across the water. The air smelled like metal and wet salt, and the light turned the color of pewter. I found Evelyn in the kitchen, barefoot, staring at the storm. Her reflection in the window looked like someone else, thinner, haunted. You left this, I said, holding the note. She didn't turn. Maybe. Then tell me what it means. You wouldn't believe me. Try me. She sighed. You remember the night of your accident? Every muscle in my body tensed. Not clearly. You were driving back from the city, she said slowly. You called Dad before it happened. You said you needed to talk about Mom. The room shrank around me. About what? Evelyn's shoulders lifted, then fell. I don't know. But that night, he took his boat out. Alone. In a storm. I frowned. He died 2 days later. Yes. She turned to face me. But the Coast Guard said he wasn't wearing his life jacket, Claire. You know he always did. The storm outside cracked open, a single white flash cutting the horizon. So you think he? I couldn't finish. I think he was running from something, she said. And I think whatever it was, it's in that letter you have. I looked toward the living room, where Dad's letter sat folded neatly on the table beside the sealed envelope David hadn't opened yet. Mom knew. I asked. Evelyn hesitated. She knows everything she can control. Thunder shook the windows. I pressed my palms against the counter to steady myself. So why help her take the house? Her voice broke. Because I thought if I did, she'd stop saying I was just the replacement. You were the favorite. You always were. I swallowed hard. You could have told me. You were in a coma, she said flatly. I didn't think you'd come back. The rain thickened into sheets. The world outside blurred into watercolor gray. Somewhere deep in the house, the power flickered. The ceiling fan slowed, then stuttered. The hum of the fridge fell silent. The quiet that followed was heavy, the kind that makes you hear your own pulse. I took the sealed envelope from the table and weighed it in my hands. Help me open it. Evelyn shook her head. That's yours, not mine. But I was already sliding a knife under the flap. Inside, another letter, shorter this time, typed on old paper. A single paragraph followed by an authorization form signed by my father. If this reaches you, Claire, it means I trusted the right man. The funds for the Hampton property aren't in the estate accounts. They're protected, in the trust one opened years ago under David's name, to be transferred to you upon proof of life. Do not let your mother sell what I built for you. There's more to her story than you know. The paper shook in my hand. He hid the trust under David's name. Evelyn's eyes widened. So David protected it. I looked toward the window, the rain streaking down in silver threads. He wasn't just keeping the house ready. He was keeping the truth. Lightning flashed again, closer this time. I turned toward the hallway. Where's Mom? Evelyn's voice dropped. Upstairs. In his room. I walked down the corridor, my bare feet soundless on the wood. The smell of rain and old perfume thickened with each step. Mom stood by the dresser, holding one of Dad's watches, the gold one he'd worn the night before his last trip. You shouldn't be up, she said without looking at me. You shouldn't have filed to declare me dead, I replied. Her fingers froze on the watch strap. I didn't declare you dead. Just gone. Gone enough to take what's mine. Her eyes lifted, calm and cold. Nothing here is yours. Your father bought this house with my family's money. I blinked. That's not true. She smiled faintly. You think you know everything about your father. You don't. He wasn't the man you worshipped, Claire. The room dimmed as another thundercloud passed overhead. Then tell me what I don't know. He was in debt, she said softly. He took loans against this house, and when I found out, I paid them. Every cent. He promised to fix it, but instead she exhaled a sharp, bitter breath. He wrote those letters. His way of saving face. The words fell like rain, cold and repetitive. But something in her tone didn't fit. A rehearsed rhythm too smooth for truth. If you paid everything, I said, why forge the deed transfer? Her expression faltered. Just a flicker, but enough. You think you're the only one who knows about deceit, she said, recovering fast. You learned it from him. Then you married it, I shot back. She slapped me. Not hard, not enough to hurt, just enough to say she still believed she could. The sound of it was swallowed by thunder. Leave, she said quietly. You've had your miracle. Don't ruin it. I stared at her, the taste of salt and blood at the back of my throat. You ruined it the moment you started pretending you were the victim. I turned and walked out, down the stairs, past the pictures of our summers, Dad holding both of us by the shoulders, the sea behind us, all of us smiling like we believed time would freeze. When I reached the porch, the rain had softened again. The air was cool now, the kind of quiet after a storm that feels like judgment. Evelyn waited by the door, her face streaked with tears or rain. I couldn't tell. Did she tell you? Enough, I said. But not everything. Behind her, headlights flashed through the rain. David's car pulled up the drive, wipers slicing rhythmically. He stepped out with a folder under his arm, rain darkening his suit. Bad weather for justice, he said, half smiling. Maybe it's the perfect weather, I said. He looked between us. You should both hear this. Your father's trust wasn't just for the house. Evelyn frowned. Then what? He handed me the folder. Inside, bank statements, correspondence, an unsigned letter in my father's handwriting. If you're reading this, Claire, and if they've made you fight for what's yours, use the money to build what they can't take. Forgiveness will cost more than property, but it's worth every cent. The wind lifted the papers slightly, then let them fall. I closed the folder. How much? David's gaze didn't waver. Enough to start over. And enough to make them tell the truth. Behind him, lightning flashed again. One last flare before the sky went quiet. The storm had passed. But inside the house, another one was just beginning. Because Evelyn wasn't looking at the folder. She was staring past me toward the staircase, her face draining of color. I turned. My mother stood halfway down, holding a photograph, one I hadn't seen before. My father on his boat, and beside him, not Evelyn, not me, another woman. Her hand trembled as she held it out. Now you understand why he left everything to you, she said, voice breaking. Because I wasn't the only one he betrayed. The air went still. The waves outside broke against the shore, slow and heavy, like the heartbeat of something ending. For a long time, none of us moved. The only sound came from the sea, long, rhythmic, merciless. The photograph fluttered once in my mother's trembling hand, the paper bending under her grip. When she finally dropped it on the table, it landed face up. My father, younger, smiling. And next to him, a woman with hair the same color as mine. Not my mother. Not Evelyn. She was his assistant, my mother said, her voice brittle, breaking. Her name was Lila Hart. They worked together for years. Evelyn covered her mouth. You knew. I knew after, she said. When he went missing on the boat, she was with him. The words fell heavy, soaked in grief and humiliation. I stared at the photo, the salt air thick in my lungs. He didn't drown alone? No, my mother said quietly. She did. I looked up sharply. What do you mean? Her eyes flicked to the window, to the horizon where the storm had retreated. The Coast Guard found 2 life vests. One torn, one untouched. They only found his body, not hers. A gull cried somewhere above the water. The house groaned in the humid quiet, old wood stretching as if it too wanted to protest. Evelyn sank into a chair, her voice a whisper. So that's why you kept the house. It wasn't just about money. My mother turned to her, her calm rebuilt piece by piece. It was about dignity. I wouldn't let the world know he left to meet her. I stared at her. You forged my signature for dignity? She didn't blink. You were gone. I was surviving. By pretending to be someone you weren't. She inhaled, eyes closing briefly. You think you would have done better? I wanted to say yes, but the words stuck somewhere between pity and rage. Before I could answer, the front door opened. David stepped back inside, rain still clinging to his jacket. His presence pulled the air tight again. He glanced at the photograph on the table. So you know. My mother's tone sharpened. You knew too. David nodded once. Your husband made me promise to keep it secret. Lila had a son, a minor at the time. He arranged funds for him, separate from this estate. I froze. A son. David hesitated, then met my eyes. He's in his 20s now. Lives in Boston. His name is Matthew Hart. The name cut through the air like a wave striking rock. Hart. He's the one Dad went to see that night, Evelyn whispered. Not Lila. Both, David said. He wanted to tell Matthew the truth before it came from someone else. My mother's face went white. You let him go. I tried to stop him, David said quietly. But he said justice had to mean something. Justice. Again that word. The one my father left behind like a ghost that wouldn't rest. So what now? Evelyn asked. He's got another heir? We split this house with a stranger. David's expression softened. Not a stranger. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another document, sealed in plastic. Matthew signed his claim away 3 months ago. My heart stumbled. What? He said this house belongs to the daughter who stayed honest. He never wanted money, only to know who his father was. My throat burned. You met him. David nodded. He looks like your father. Talks like you. I sank into the nearest chair, dizzy. Somewhere, deep beneath the fatigue and grief, something inside me loosened, like a knot undone by the tide. For the first time, I didn't feel wronged. I felt seen. My mother turned away, gripping the back of the chair. I suppose that makes me the villain. No, I said softly. Just human. Like him. Evelyn looked between us. So what happens to us? I took a long breath, feeling the salt cling to my skin. That depends on what we do next. David placed the last paper on the table. The trust is officially yours, Claire. You can evict them, sell it, or let it stand. I looked toward the window, the sky clearing over the Atlantic. I won't sell it. But I'm not the only one who needs to stay. My mother blinked. You're letting us. Stay, I said. But under truth, not lies. Evelyn's tears finally broke. She covered her face with both hands, shoulders shaking. David smiled faintly. You sound like him. I nodded toward the envelope on the table, the one that had started all this. I understand him now. The sun broke through the clouds then, spilling gold across the floorboards, onto the piano, and finally onto the photograph of my father. For a moment everything shimmered. The kind of light that makes you believe summer can fix anything. But peace never comes without cost. Because as the light shifted, I noticed something under the photograph. Another envelope. Smaller, older, sealed with wax. Evelyn frowned. What's that? Picked it up. My father's initials. The date. A week before my accident. David frowned. I've never seen that. I broke the seal. Inside a note. Faded ink. Just one line. If anything happens to Claire, it won't be an accident. The room froze. Evelyn's breath caught. Oh my God. My mother's voice was small, almost lost. What are you saying? I looked up at her. I think someone made sure that car never made it home. Lightning cracked again. Far off over the ocean, faint but echoing. Justice, it seemed, wasn't finished with us yet. The silence after that letter felt heavier than the storm. No one breathed. No one blinked. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, the air so still that even the waves sounded cautious. I read the line again. If anything happens to Claire, it won't be an accident. It wasn't just a warning. It was a confession disguised as protection. I felt every heartbeat like thunder under my ribs. He knew, I whispered. He knew before it happened. Evelyn's voice broke the silence first. You think he meant Mom? I looked at her. You tell me. My mother's lips parted. No denial, just a flicker of fear she couldn't swallow fast enough. You're imagining things, she said, but her tone was too calm, too measured. David stepped closer. His lawyer's composure gone. Martha, where was the car that week? In the garage, she said quickly. Until she took it. Who serviced it last? She hesitated. The local shop. The one near the marina. Evelyn frowned. That was Derek's shop. The name landed like a stone. Derek had been my mother's longtime friend, one of those men who hovered too close at funerals and fixed things that weren't broken. David's voice was sharp now. Martha, did you ask him to inspect it or to disable it? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I stepped forward. You wanted me out of the way before Dad changed the will. Her eyes glistened. You don't understand what it was like. He was leaving everything to you. To you. The truth came out with a sob, raw and unpolished. I built this life. I raised you. And he was going to give it all away to prove I was the greedy one. So you tried to prove him right, I said softly. She sank into the nearest chair, trembling. I didn't mean for it to happen. I just told Derek to delay the car's maintenance. He must have done more. David's voice was quiet but absolute. That's attempted manslaughter. Evelyn covered her mouth, tears streaking her face. Mom! My mother looked up at me, pleading now. Claire, please. You have everything. Don't take the rest of my life too. For a long time I didn't move. The ocean murmured beyond the windows, the tide rising again. Patient, unbothered by human sins. Then I said the only thing that felt true. I don't want your life. I just want mine back. I turned to David. What happens next? He took a slow breath. Legally, we report it. But the choice is yours, Claire. Your father wanted justice, not vengeance. I stared at my mother, the woman who had made me strong enough to survive her. I thought of Evelyn, who had lied to feel loved, and of my father, who built a house sturdy enough to outlast our mistakes. Finally, I nodded. We'll tell the truth, but not to punish her. To end this. The police came quietly the next morning. No handcuffs, no shouting. Just soft voices and the sound of doors closing. My mother didn't fight. She just looked back at the house one last time before the car took her away. Evelyn stood on the porch beside me, barefoot, her face pale in the morning light. Will she go to prison? For a while, I said. But I'll make sure she has what she needs. She nodded, crying without sound. Then after a pause, she whispered, "Thank you for not hating me." I looked at her. You're my sister. You made terrible choices. So did I. Let's build something better. She gave a small broken laugh. Like what? Like forgiveness, I said. That evening, the house smelled of lemon oil again. The air was warm, still heavy with the scent of rain. David came by with papers for me to sign, the last of the transfers, the official restoration of ownership. He lingered by the porch rail, the sky behind him turning coral and violet. You did the right thing, he said. I smiled faintly. You mean the legal thing? He shook his head. The human thing. Not many can tell the difference. We stood in silence watching the sea. When the light hit just right, the water turned the color of glass, fragile but endless. You'll stay here, he asked. For the summer, I said. Then maybe I'll rebuild the deck like Dad wanted. Something new but still ours. David nodded. That's exactly what justice looks like. Before he left, he placed something on the table. A small envelope unmarked. Inside was a photo. Me from years ago at the piano. My father behind me laughing. On the back, written in his handwriting, for when you forget how strong you are. The sun dipped low. The tide began to rise. And for the first time in years, the house felt whole again. That night, as the cicadas hummed outside and the air cooled through the open windows, I whispered into the dark, not for anyone else to hear. That was the summer I finally understood what real justice feels like. What did you think of my story? Would you have chosen forgiveness? Or revenge? Leave your thoughts in the comments and rate it from 0 to 10. And don't miss the next story. I spent the summer at my family's beach house and found letters my late mother hid in the attic. In that one, a woman finds her mother's secret sealed in dust and learns that sometimes the past isn't buried. It's waiting.